Okay, so you head into work each day, and you know you're good at what you do.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get this feeling like, is it really a fair shot for everyone? Like, are there things, I don't know, maybe hidden things that could be holding someone back from really getting ahead based on, who they are, not what they can actually do?
Right, right. I mean, is it really a level playing field? That's a huge question. It's a big concern. And honestly, it's really hard to know for sure.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why we are digging deep into this today on the Deep Dive. We're going to try to unpack how these laws in the U.S., those equal employment opportunity laws, how they really play out when it comes to keeping your job and making sure everyone has a fair chance to succeed at work.
Exactly.
And a big thanks to you guys listening, because you sent us this incredible trove of information
Yeah.
straight from the source. Those regulations from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. It's like going right into the rule book.
The ECFR, right.
Exactly.
The Electronic Code of Federal Regulations.
Straight from the ECFR.
So this is our deep dive, our attempt to help, break it all down.
That's the mission.
Okay, so starting with the basics, and I think even if folks know this, it's always good to have a refresher. What is EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity, at its core?
So EEO, you can really boil it down to this.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that everybody has an equal chance to get ahead at work.
Okay.
That means eliminating any sort of barriers or disadvantages that might be based on things like your race, your religion, your gender. It shouldn't matter.
Right.
It should be about your talent, your hard work, your skills. That's what determines your success. And this is especially important because, let's be honest, historically, there's been a lot of systemic discrimination in the workplace, right? EEO laws were created to try and counteract that. And the goal, really the big picture, is to make sure everyone has the opportunity to succeed without those unfair barriers.
Okay, so then the EEOC, they're the folks making sure these laws are actually followed.
Right. They're like the watchdog agency for these laws. It's a federal agency, and their mission is to prevent and remedy unlawful employment discrimination and advance equal opportunity for all. It was really a powerful statement.
Yeah, that's quite a mission. So they investigate if things go wrong, they try to make it right, and they educate everyone about the rules.
Exactly. They do it all, investigations, guidance, and even legal action if necessary. They're really the enforcers of these laws.
So our deep dive here is really a guide to understanding these protections that you have as a worker. And starting with the foundation, what are the main laws that build this whole concept of EEO?
Okay, so there are a handful of crucial laws that are really the bedrock of EEO in the U.S.
Okay, lay on us.
The first one, probably the most well-known, is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a game changer. It basically prohibits employers from discriminating against anyone based on their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And get this, it covers pretty much every part of your job. We're talking hiring, firing, pay, promotions, training, you name it. Even just the day-to-day treatment like harassment is covered.
So Title VII is like the big umbrella.
Exactly. It casts a really wide net of protection across the workplace.
What else? What other laws came into play to solidify these rights?
Right. So another one, this one's actually from a little bit earlier, the Equal Pay Act of 1963.
Okay.
And as you might guess, it specifically targets pay discrimination based on someone's sex.
Okay, so men and women should get equal pay for doing the same job, basically.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
There.
If you're doing essentially the same work, similar skills, effort, responsibilities, all under comparable conditions, then your pay shouldn't be different just because you're a man or a woman.
Makes sense.
It's all about closing that wage gap that, unfortunately, can still exist based solely on someone's gender.
Okay, so Title VII, Equal Pay Act. What else makes up this foundation of EEO?
All right, next up, we've got the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, or ADEA for short.
ADEA, okay.
And this one's all about protecting older workers, anyone 40 years or older. It basically says an employer can't refuse to hire you, fire you, or treat you differently, when it comes to promotions or benefits or anything like that, just because you're older.
So no pushing someone out because they're getting close to retirement or thinking they can't keep up?
Exactly. Skills and experience are valuable.
Right.
They shouldn't be discounted simply because of someone's age.
And what about people with disabilities? What protects them from discrimination?
The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or ADA, comes in here. This is a big one. It prohibits discrimination against anyone with a disability as long as they're qualified for the job, of course, in both the private and public sectors.
Okay.
And what's especially important about the ADA is that it also requires employers to provide what they call reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities.
Okay, now that's a phrase I hear a lot, but what does that actually mean in practice? What's a reasonable accommodation?
Good question. It basically means that the employer needs to make changes or adjustments to the job or the work environment to allow someone with a disability to do the job and enjoy the same benefits as anyone else.
Got it.
So, this could be things like modifying equipment, making the workplace physically accessible, adjusting work schedules, offering different ways to do tasks, anything that helps them perform the essential functions of the job without putting an unreasonable burden on the employer.
Okay, so it's about finding a balance, a way to be inclusive without creating major disruptions or costs for the business.
Right. The ADA recognizes that there are limits to what's reasonable. There's this concept of undue hardship, which means that the accommodation would be too difficult or too expensive for the employer to provide, and then they wouldn't be required to do it.
Makes sense.
But the bar for that's pretty high. It has to be a real significant difficulty or expense, taking into account, the size and resources of the employer.
So it's not just, oh, this is a little inconvenient. It has to be a genuine burden.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've got Title VII, Equal Pay Act, ADA, anything else?
Yes. We also have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, JANA.
Okay, Gina. Yeah, that's a newer one, right?
Yes. This one deals with the increasingly important issue of genetic information.
Right.
JANA prohibits employers from discriminating against you based on your genetic information. That includes things like your family medical history.
Wow.
So employers can't ask for that information, they can't require you to provide it, and they certainly can't use it when making decisions about hiring, firing, or anything else work-related.
That's a relief to hear.
Yeah, it's all about preventing people from being discriminated against based on the possibility of future health risks that might be revealed in their genes or their family history.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense.
It's about protecting people from assumptions and biases based on something they might not even develop.
Okay, what about specific protections for people who are pregnant?
That's where the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, PDA, comes in. It's an amendment to Title VII. And it basically spells out that discrimination based on pregnancy, childbirth, or any related medical condition is a form of sex discrimination. So you can't treat a pregnant employee differently than other employees similar in their ability or inability to work.
Okay.
You can't fire them, deny them promotions, or treat them poorly just because they're pregnant.
Makes sense.
It's about recognizing the unique needs of pregnant employees and ensuring that they have the same rights and opportunities as anyone else.
Okay, so we've got a lot of laws here. Title VII, Equal Pay Act, ADA, ADA, GINA, PDA. Is there anything else that's important to mention in this whole framework of EEO?
Yes. I almost forgot the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Okay, the Rehabilitation Act, what's that all about?
This one is very similar to the ADA, but it specifically focuses on discrimination against people with disabilities in programs run by the federal government.
Okay.
So, if you work for a federal agency or you're participating in a program that receives federal funding, you're protected under Rehabilitation Act.
Got it.
It basically ensures that these government programs are accessible to everyone and that people with disabilities aren't excluded or treated unfairly.
So it's like the ADA, but specifically for the federal government.
Exactly. Same principles, different area of focus.
Okay, so wow. Together, all these laws, they create a really, a solid framework, right?
Yeah.
Like a whole web of protection against discrimination.
They really do. They set the ground rules for fairness in
Yeah.
the workplace.
Yeah.
And it's about saying, your ability to do the job, that's what matters, not your race, your religion, your age, any of that.
Right.
Those things shouldn't hold you back.
Okay, so we talked about the laws, but the EEOC, they're the ones making sure those laws are actually being followed. They're like the enforcers, the watchdogs.
Exactly.
So how do they do that? What does that look like in practice?
Well, their main job, of course, is to enforce these federal laws against discrimination.
Right.
And they do that in a few different ways. First off, if someone feels like they've been discriminated against, they can file a charge with the EEOC.
Okay.
That's like the first step.
Got it.
And then the EEOC will investigate that claim, try to figure out what happened, and if they find enough evidence to believe that discrimination did occur, they'll try to resolve it.
So what does an investigation involve?
It depends on the situation, but generally they'll talk to both sides.
Yeah.
The employee who filed the charge and the employer They might interview witnesses. They'll look at documents. They're trying to get the full picture.
Right.
And then if they believe there's enough evidence, the first thing they'll try to do is resolve the issue informally. They call this conciliation.
Conciliation.
Yeah. And a lot of times this involves mediation. They try to get both sides to come to an agreement voluntarily to fix the problem.
So it's not automatically a lawsuit.
Right. The goal is to find a solution that works for everyone without having to go to court. But of course, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, they just can't reach an agreement.
And then what?
Well, if conciliation doesn't work, then the EEOC has the power to sue the employer in federal court.
Okay, so they're not messing around. They can actually take them to court.
Exactly. They have real legal authority to enforce these laws.
Yeah.
But of course, they don't take every case to court. They have to prioritize.
Yeah, I imagine they get a lot of charges.
They do, yeah.
Yeah.
So they're looking at things like the strength of the evidence, the potential impact of the discrimination, the resources they have available. They have to be strategic.
Makes sense.
But the important thing is that the option is there.
Right.
They have that power if they need it.
Okay, so investigating charges and taking legal action when necessary, that's a big part of what they do. But what else? I feel like there's more.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of their work is focused on prevention.
Okay, tell me about that.
They do a ton of education and outreach,
Yeah.
trying to help both employers and employees understand these laws.
Okay.
They issue guidelines, they conduct training, they provide technical assistance. They want to make sure everyone knows their rights and responsibilities and hopefully prevent discrimination from happening in the first place.
So it's not just about reacting to problems, it's about getting ahead of them.
Exactly. It's about creating a more informed and proactive approach to EEO. And really relevant to what we're talking about today, the EEOC also interprets those broader laws that we talked about.
Okay.
They break them down into specific regulations and guidelines,
Right.
For different workplace situations.
Got it.
And those are what we find in the ECFR, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations.
Right.
They're giving practical guidance on how these laws actually work in real life.
Okay, so the ECFR is where all the fine print is, all the details. What exactly is that, and how is it organized?
Okay, so picture this. The ECFR is like a giant, always updated online library of every single federal regulation. And I do mean every regulation. It's updated daily.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, yeah. But the good news is that it's organized in a way that makes it actually pretty easy to find what you're looking for.
Okay, how so?
It's broken down into 50 main topics called titles.
Okay.
And within each title, you've got chapters, often specific to a certain agency.
Got it.
So, for example, Title 29 is all about labor, and Chapter 4/5 within that title is all about the EEOC.
Right, that makes sense. So if you're looking for something EEOC related, you go to Title 29, Chapter 14.
Exactly. And then within each chapter, you have parts, which are basically like subtopics, and then each part is broken down further into sections, which are the individual detailed rules.
Okay, so it's like titles are the big categories, chapters are like the books, parts are the chapters, and sections are the paragraphs.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so then if I wanted to find the EEOC's rules about, let's say, sex discrimination, where would I go in that ECFR maze?
Okay, so first you'd go to Title 29 Labor. Then you'd find Chapter 14, which is for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And within that chapter, you'd look for the part that covers sex discrimination. In this case, it's Part 1604, Guidelines on Discrimination because of sex.
Okay, so each part has a specific focus.
Right. There's a part for religious discrimination, Part 1605. There's one for age discrimination, Part 1625. You've got one for the Americans with Disabilities Act, Part 1630, and one for genetic information discrimination, Part 1635. There's even a part specifically about equal employment opportunity within the federal government, Part 1614.
So each part really digs deep into a specific protected characteristic or law.
Yeah, that's the idea. It lets you zero in on the information you need.
Makes sense. Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to those key protections that we talked about under each of those laws and how those are spelled out in the ECFR.
Sounds good.
Let's start with race and color discrimination. What are the core protections there?
Okay, so the regulations on race and color discrimination, they're based on Title VII. They make it super clear that you can't discriminate against someone because of their race or their color. And when they say race, they mean things like your ancestry, your ethnic background, your traits associated with race. And color refers to like pigmentation, skin color.
Okay.
And this protection is really comprehensive.
Yeah.
It covers everything: hiring, firing, promotions, pay, benefits, training, how you're treated every day, the whole 9 yards. And what's important is that it covers both what we call disparate treatment,
Hmm.
outright discrimination, where you're intentionally treating someone differently because of their race or color.
Right.
But it also covers disparate impact. That's where a policy might seem neutral on the surface, but it ends up having a negative effect on people of a certain race or color.
Okay, can you give me an example of that?
Sure, imagine a company that has a rule about certain hairstyles. It might seem like a neutral rule, but if it disproportionately excludes people of a particular race from getting hired or promoted, then that could be discrimination based on disparate impact.
Got it. So even if it wasn't intentional, the effect is discriminatory.
Exactly. The EEOC is really concerned with both the intention and the outcome.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, there's also the issue of racial harassment. That's a big no-no as well. Things like offensive jokes, slurs, insults, any kind of behavior that creates a hostile work environment based on race. That's all illegal, and employers have a duty to prevent it and to correct it if it happens.
Okay, so employers can't just say, oh, I didn't know that was happening. They're responsible for creating a workplace where that kind of behavior is not tolerated.
Right. They can't just turn a blind eye. They have to be proactive.
Okay, what about religious discrimination?
So, when it comes to religion, the ECFR regulations, specifically Part 1605, they highlight the employer's obligation to provide reasonable accommodations for their employees' sincerely held religious beliefs.
Okay.
And as long as it doesn't cause an undue hardship on the business, they have to do it.
Right, so it's a balancing act like we talked about with the ADA.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to respect religious practices without creating an excessive burden.
Hmm.
An undue hardship, it's not just a minor inconvenience. It's got to be something pretty significant, something that would be really difficult or expensive for the employer to accommodate.
Okay, so what are some examples of reasonable accommodations for religious beliefs?
Sure. So think about an employee who needs to take time off for religious holidays.
Hmm.
A reasonable accommodation might be letting them use vacation time or personal days, or letting them adjust their work schedule to make up the time.
Right.
Or maybe an employee wears religious clothing or head coverings.
Yeah.
Unless there's a real legitimate safety issue, the employer probably has to accommodate that too.
Makes sense.
And of course, employers can't discriminate against someone in hiring or firing based on their religion. There have been real cases, like Blackwell Security Services was penalized because they wouldn't let an employee grow a beard for religious reasons.
Wow.
And JBS Swift, they got in trouble for not letting Muslim employees take prayer breaks. So this is serious stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And it sounds like those cases really highlight that employers need to be willing to engage in that interactive process we talked about. Like, have a conversation with the employee, see what the needs are, and try to find a solution that works for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about communication, finding common ground.
Okay, let's move on to sex discrimination. Now, this area has been in the news a lot, and it seems like the understanding of what constitutes sex discrimination has really broadened in recent years.
Oh, absolutely. There's been significant evolution in this area.
So, what does the ECFR have to say about sex discrimination today?
So Part 1604 of the ECFR, which interprets Title VII in this area, it takes a very broad approach. So obviously it includes pregnancy discrimination.
Right.
You can't discriminate against someone because they're pregnant, childbirth, any related medical conditions. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act made that clear. But then, in light of recent Supreme Court decisions, especially Bostock v. Clayton County, the EEOC now interprets sex discrimination to also cover sexual orientation and gender identity.
Okay, so that means discriminating against someone because they're LGBTQ plus is illegal under federal law.
Exactly. That's a major shift in the legal landscape, and it provides critical protection for a whole group of people who've historically faced a lot of discrimination in the workplace. And, of course, the regulations also cover sexual harassment, which is a huge issue.
Right.
And that includes the obvious stuff like unwanted sexual advances and requests for sexual favors. But it also covers creating a hostile work environment based on sex, even if it doesn't involve direct propositions.
Okay, so things like, I don't know, offensive jokes, inappropriate comments, maybe even just a general atmosphere that makes someone feel uncomfortable because of their sex. That's all included.
Exactly. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of their sex or gender identity. And employers have a huge responsibility to prevent and address sexual harassment.
And I imagine there are a lot of nuances to what constitutes a hostile work environment, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the EEOC provides lots of guidance on that. They also provide resources for employers to help them create policies and procedures to prevent harassment.
Good.
And of course, as we talked about with the Equal Pay Act, the regulations also cover unequal pay and benefits based on sex. It's all about ensuring equality across the board.
Okay, makes sense.
Uh,
And are there any real cases, any examples that come to mind that illustrate how these protections are being applied?
Yeah, so there was a situation with Walmart where they allegedly failed to promote a woman to a management position because of stereotypes about mothers. They thought that as a mother, she wouldn't be as committed to the job. And in another case, a construction company discouraged a woman from even applying for a job because they thought it was a man's job.
Wow, those are really clear examples of how gender stereotypes can still creep in and how the EEOC is stepping in to address those issues.
Exactly. They're taking these cases seriously.
Okay, let's talk about discrimination based on national origin. What does that encompass, and how does the ECFR protect against it?
So the EEOC regulations in Part 1606, they say that you can't be discriminated against because of your national origin. And that includes things like your birthplace, your ancestry, your culture, your language, even your accent.
So employers can't make decisions about hiring, firing, promotions, or anything else based on those factors.
Exactly. They're looking for neutral criteria, things
Yeah.
that are actually related to the job. And one area where they've been particularly active is in cases involving English-only rules in the workplace.
Right, I've heard about those.
Those are generally considered discriminatory unless the employer can show that there's a really clear business necessity for having such a rule and they've properly informed their employees about it.
So it's not a blanket ban on speaking any language other than English at work.
Right. It has to be carefully justified and applied. And then, of course, just like with race and religion, harassment based on national origin is also illegal.
Okay, so things like ethnic slurs or offensive jokes, making someone feel unwelcome because of their ethnicity, that's all covered.
Exactly. And there have been cases about this too. For example, United Airlines got in trouble for a situation where an employee was harassed with racial slurs based on their Mongolian ancestry, even though they were Asian American.
Interesting.
And in another case, a Serbian American applicant, even though he had excellent English skills, wasn't hired as a cashier because the manager was worried about his name and accent.
Wow, it's hard to believe that still happened.
It does, unfortunately, but that's why these regulations are so important. They're there to address those subtle biases and to make sure everyone's treated fairly.
Okay, let's move on to age discrimination. Who exactly is protected under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and what are the key things we should know about it?
So the ADEA and Part 1525 of the ECFR protect anyone who's 40 years or older from discrimination at work.
Okay.
And it covers everything: hiring, firing, pay, promotions, benefits.
The whole works.
The whole works, yeah. And the point is that employers can't make assumptions about someone's abilities or work ethic just because of their age. They can't say, you're too old to learn new things, or you're not going to be here long enough to be worth the investment.
Right.
That's all age discrimination. Now, there are a few very narrow exceptions, like if being a certain age is absolutely essential to doing the job safely and effectively, they call that a bona fide occupational qualification, a BFOQ.
Okay.
But those situations are rare, and even then, they're interpreted very narrowly. It's not just a matter of preference. It has to be a real necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been a lot of cases where the EEOC has stepped in to protect older workers.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, there was one involving J&M Industries where they allegedly pressured a 65-year-old employee to retire, even though he wanted to keep working.
Wow.
And another case involved a software development company that fired a 62-year-old employee, even though he was performing well, because they thought they needed someone younger who was more tech-savvy.
So they just made an assumption based on his age.
Exactly. And that's what the ADA is designed to prevent.
Okay, and finally, what about disability discrimination? What does the ADA say, and how does the ECFR flesh out those protections?
So Part 1630 of the ECFR deals with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities.
Yeah.
And the definition of disability is pretty broad. It includes any physical or mental impairment that significantly limits a major life activity. And as we talked about earlier, the law requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities unless it would cause an undue hardship.
Right.
And that includes making changes to the application process, the work environment, the way the job is performed, anything that helps them do the job.
Right.
And again, it's all about that interactive process, talking to the employee, figuring out what works. There was a case involving McLean Northeast where a deaf applicant was denied an interview for warehouse positions, even though he was qualified, and the EEOC stepped in because it seemed like a clear case of discrimination.
Right, the company should have at least explored ways to accommodate his deafness.
Exactly. And in another case, Walmart got in trouble for initially refusing to let an employee with a prosthetic leg use an electric cart as an accommodation.
That's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
it's about being flexible and recognizing that people with disabilities can contribute just as much as anyone else if they're given the support they need.
Okay, and finally, I know we touched on this earlier, but can you just remind us briefly about the protections against discrimination based on genetic information?
Sure. So Gina embryo and Part 1635 of the ECFR are all about preventing discrimination based on your genes or your family's medical history.
Mhm.
So employers can't ask for that information, they can't use it to make decisions, and they have to keep it confidential if they happen to get it.
Okay.
And there have been cases where the EEOC has gone after employers who violated this law.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, there was a case involving Factor One Source Pharmacy where they were allegedly pressuring employees about their use of expensive hemophilia prescriptions and asking about their family's genetic history, which is completely inappropriate.
Wow.
In another case, Fabricant allegedly refused to hire a woman based on a perceived risk of carpal tunnel syndrome, and they had improperly requested her family medical history to make that determination.
It's amazing how much this stuff still happens.
It does, yeah, but that's why it's so important to know your rights and to know that the EEOC is out there fighting for you.
Absolutely. Hearing these real cases, it really brings home how critical these regulations are and how they impact real people's lives.
Yeah, these aren't just abstract legal concepts. They're about protecting real people from real harm.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and it's been a fascinating deep dive into this world of EEO laws.
Yeah, it's complex, but it's so important.
It's reassuring to know that we have these laws and that the EEOC is there to enforce them.
Absolutely. They're a critical safeguard against discrimination in the workplace.
So for everyone listening, remember those federal EEO laws. They're there to protect you from discrimination based on your race, your color, your religion, your sex, your national origin, your age, your disability, your genetic information.
It's a long list, but it covers a lot of important ground.
And the ECFR, don't forget about the ECFR.
Right, it's a great resource.
It breaks down all those laws into detail, and it's free and accessible online.
Definitely worth checking out.
And remember, the EEOC is there for you too. They can provide guidance, they have resources, and they can help if you believe you've been discriminated against.
Right, don't be afraid to reach out to them if you need help.
So I hope everyone listening feels a little bit more empowered, a little more knowledgeable about their rights in the workplace.
That's the goal.
Because you deserve to work in an environment where you're treated fairly and with respect. And as you go about your day, your week, your work life, think about these protections. How do they play out in your own workplace?
Yeah.
Have you seen examples of them being upheld? Have you maybe seen situations where they're being challenged? It's definitely something to be aware of and to speak up about if you see something that doesn't seem right.
Absolutely. Knowledge is